Yeah, I watch them. I watch them, and I watch your dad the whole time because I don't care what I look like.
Hi, and welcome back to Friday Questions. I'm Luke,
And I am Mark.
and today we're going to talk about Daniel 7, where Mark will tell you specifically why, without a shadow of a doubt, the bear has 3 ribs in his mouth.
There is a theory out there. There's a 3-rib theory.
All right, Daniel 7, do you want to give us a recap?
Daniel 7 begins the second half of the book in which the majority of the text is in referencing multiple dreams and visions that Daniel has that are very prophetic in nature. So if you'll recall, the first 6 chapters really are narrative, they're story, events happening in Daniel's life, in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's life.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a shift here beginning in chapter 7. And chapter 9, which you'll be preaching on in a couple of weeks, has
Next
a
week.
prayer. And next week, yes, has a prayer within it. But the bulk of the text from 7 through 12 are prophetic visions that Daniel has. And as we were just discussing earlier today, the visions seem to have a very harsh impact on Daniel. Like at the end of chapter 7 and at the end of
Yeah.
chapter 8, he is wrecked.
Yeah, every
after
time he
these
has one,
visions.
he's like, and I was greatly troubled.
Yeah, even to the point of sickness. Like,
He's like,
we
I had to lay down the rest of the day.
we were talking about Daniel 8. We're recording this on a Wednesday. We were talking about Daniel 8 today because that's this upcoming weekend's message, and Pastor Ray was walking through the chapter with us. And we noticed at the end of chapter 8, Daniel said he was physically ill, and I think a few days went by, and then he went back to the king's business. Like he had to take a couple of personal days
Yeah.
after this vision because they're very jarring. And I think one of the reasons why is because as we look back on them, they're so specific and so precise,
Yeah.
which is going to lead to one of our questions today. And so in this specific chapter, Daniel 7, Daniel has a vision of 4 beasts, is the best way to describe them. 4 animals that then later we understand to be the 4 major world powers, beginning with Babylon, moving to the Medes and the Persians, then the Greeks, and then the Romans. And one more thing before we get rolling, and that is that there's this really great way in which some of these chapters in Daniel are set up. First of all, Daniel chapters 2 through 7 are a chunk of Old Testament scripture that are not written in Hebrew.
Yes.
They're written in Aramaic.
Yeah.
Which was a common language of the day. We know that Jesus spoke Aramaic later on in the New Testament era. But the other part that's really interesting is that if you take chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they have parallels with one another. So chapter 2 parallels chapter 7,
Mm-hmm.
3 parallels 6, and 4 parallels 5. If you just go back and think about it, chapter 2 was Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue. And that's going to lie quite nicely next to Daniel 7 and his dream of the 4 beasts.
Right.
Daniel 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den.
Mm.
Chapters 4 and 5, Nebuchadnezzar's challenge to be humble, and he doesn't, but he learns from it and responds positively. Belshazzar, his son, chance to be humble, doesn't learn from it, and he's destroyed that night. So it's kind of cool how even the literature is set up to be in a mirror image as we work our way through these chapters. And so in many ways, chapter 2 and chapter 7 have a lot of parallels to them.
Yeah.
And specifically, we see that the 4 major world powers in chapter 2 match up to the 4 major world powers in chapter 7.
Yeah. Which dovetails nicely into our first question.
Yes.
Which is, how do we know the dreams in Daniel 7 in this case are talking about those 4 kingdoms? Then those 4 kingdoms would be...
So, yes, we have what we believe to be the first kingdom discussed in both the Daniel 7 and Daniel 2 dreams is Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were overthrown by the Medes and the Persians, and even with that, the Persians kind of overtook the Medes. Then the Greek dynasty under Alexander the Great, and then the Roman dynasty shortly thereafter. And so the question, which is a great question, is how do we know that the dreams in these two chapters, specifically chapter 7, how do we know they match up to those four major superpowers?
And there is a faction who believes that the fourth one is actually Greece and not Rome.
Some people, will flip around who they are and who they might be, and some have even said that the fourth one hasn't even arrived yet on the historical scene, or is the fourth one maybe, as we'll talk about this later, maybe it was the Roman superpower, but it also will be mirrored by another superpower to come potentially. Right. We'll get into that in a few minutes.
Yeah.
But how do we know that? Well, I think probably the majority of people who land on an understanding that those four superpowers are who are being discussed here is that the way they're described, if you take Daniel 2 and Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which in many ways is like man's perspective on those four superpowers.
Yeah.
And then Daniel 7 would be in some ways God's vision or
that's a good way to describe
God's understanding of what he sees, because a beast would be something that is ferocious and violent, uncontrollable, and yet doesn't have the power that God has.
Yeah.
If you line them up, you see that the characteristics really match nicely onto what we know about those four major kingdoms that existed from Daniel's day, past Daniel's day, into Jesus's day. So, real quick, let's just run through them again. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and then which superpower goes with it. So the head of gold in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which in Daniel 7 was described as a lion with wings. Well, those would be some of the characteristics of the Babylonian Empire. The swiftness and the ferocity of a lion, the ferociousness of a lion. In Daniel 7, the lion at one point begins to speak like a man, which does that maybe mirror Nebuchadnezzar going from beast to man? Potentially, some have wondered that. Then the next one, which in Daniel 2 was the chest and arms, which were made of silver, which notice that the value of the metal decreases as we go through these. In Daniel 7, it's a bear with 3 ribs. Those would be the Medes and the Persians. Now, here's what's great. In Daniel 2, a chest with 2 arms, Medes and Persians.
Oh.
The bear in chapter 7, one side was raised up higher than the other because eventually the Persians kind of overtook the Medes. Then that bear in Daniel 7 has 3 ribs. There were 3 major areas of the world that the Medes and Persians conquered. Lydia, Egypt, and then Babylon. And so some have wondered if the 3 ribs are the 3 major regions that they took over because their empire was even larger than Babylon's empire. All right, then the waist of bronze, which in Daniel 7 is a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, would be the Greek dynasty. Leopard because Alexander the Great was so swift in conquering the world. And then we know historically that after Alexander the Great died, his region, which was pretty much the known world at that point, at least around the Mediterranean and up into Europe, was divided between 4 of his generals. So they've wondered if the 4 heads or the 4 wings would be that. And then finally, the legs of iron, or in Daniel 7, it was just described as a dreadful beast. No specific animal that we would know of with iron teeth. So is it interesting that in Daniel 2, legs of iron, Daniel 7, iron teeth, we believe would be the Roman
Why do you
dynasty.
think the metals get progressively less valuable?
We think it's probably because with each next empire, they don't have perhaps the wealth and the authority. We forget that the Babylonian Empire was just tremendous, maybe not in its size, but in its wealth. The hanging gardens that supposedly Babylon was known for, that Nebuchadnezzar helped build, the amount of gold that was used in that area, that with each next kingdom, there wasn't the maybe amount of power, the totality of power, maybe wider region, but the amount of wealth to it, that they decreased in efficiency, they decreased in their effectiveness, in their glory. Like in many ways, the argument would be that Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon was the height of a superpower, and each one was progressively not as strong or not as efficient, maybe didn't sustain what it could sustain That would be because then at the bottom, even in Daniel 2, you get to the feet that are an iron and clay mix,
Yeah.
which is really like there's some
Brittle.
iron there, but yeah, fall parts easily, parts of easily, has some value, but also has worthlessness to it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I guess to say, like, to answer the question, how do we know it's talking about those four kingdoms? A lot of it is the fact that Daniel's looking forward in time and we're looking back in time,
right.
and we can say, look, this lines up with how stuff happened. And so that's a lot of where our judgment on that comes from. But we know they're kingdoms because in the dream, he's told by an angel, these represent the kingdoms that are to come. So we know
Correct.
they're kingdoms, so at least that is narrowed down for us, and we can see how they line up. And I don't know if we talked about this last week, but there are some people who say that there's no way Daniel was written
Right.
when they say it was written because of how accurate it is.
Yes, some have tried to argue that Daniel had to have been written during the Roman dynasty to be able to have such precision based
Yeah.
upon how accurate and how each part of those dreams and visions match up to those four powers.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's how accurate they are, that people have to pump Daniel to a later time period.
Yeah.
And so that's why there's a lot of unanimousness, a lot of complete agreement, easier
Yeah.
to say, on how those four powers are probably the four that are represented there. There's
Yeah.
some disagreement here and there in some of the later powers,
Yeah.
but for many, it's because of the attributes of those superpowers match up the attributes in the two dreams.
Yeah, yeah.
Definitely.
So I guess that kind of transitions into the next question,
Right.
assuming we answered that first question well enough.
I think so.
Yeah. So that transitions to the next question, which is, why are the biblical prophecies so hard to understand?
Right. It's a great question, and that's why there's so much ink written on different prophecies. That's why there have been people throughout time who have tried to be very precise with saying that this means this and that means that and pinning things down. One of the things that we've been discussing is the understanding that many prophecies in Scripture have what is often referred to as like a dual fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
Or some people use the phrase already and not yet,
Yeah.
where there may be something said that prophetically gets answered relatively close to the time that it was stated,
Yeah.
but there's also maybe even within where we stand now in 2022, there is still a future fulfillment waiting, that it may be fulfilled in stages, or there may be a fulfillment and then another fulfillment much like it later on.
Right.
We even see some of this here in Daniel, where there's a few prophecies coming up that we're going to see in the next few chapters that were fulfilled during either the Greek or Roman time period.
Right.
And yet, there is the potential for something like that to also occur in the future.
Yeah.
And one of the analogies that we both like real well that helps with this is thinking about looking at a mountain range from a distance.
Yeah.
Because as you look at a mountain range, it in many ways looks like it's just one mountain in the future. And that would represent the idea that we think, oh, here's a prophecy and it has one fulfillment in the future. And yet as we get closer to the mountain range, what do we discover?
That they're actually a lot further apart than they looked from where we were standing at the time.
Right. There could be a shorter peak here, and then there's a valley or something, and then a larger peak, and there's multiple layers to the mountain range. There isn't just one mountain peak that we're looking at. And that perhaps that helps us understand why prophecies can have multiple fulfillments over different periods of time. You can even think about how, in many ways, the confusion when Jesus first came to earth in the Gospels is that many who had read the Old Testament assumed that the Messiah was going to fulfill all of these prophecies
At once.
And we, again, having hindsight, know that he really came to fulfill some, and others he will fulfill at his second coming.
Yeah.
They saw one Messiah coming one time. We see a Messiah coming twice.
Yeah.
The first time to die through and serve, the second to reign as king.
And we know that because Jesus said it.
Yeah, that helped.
Yeah.
That helped. But I always try to picture if I were a first century Jew and I was hearing this, what if I would just like your whole paradigm would be thrown because now you're like, wait, so Messiah isn't coming because they thought he was coming to rescue them physically at that moment,
Yeah.
overthrow Rome, kick them out of Jerusalem,
Yeah.
set up the kingdom. So wouldn't that also be the same of other prophecies? In this case, the ones that we're reading in Daniel's writings. That could he be talking about things that did happen fairly quickly in human history, but also could have a long range, still to come
Yeah.
prophetic fulfillment?
And then you see that in other places where you see some confusion from people. I was just listening to talk about Matthew 23, when there's two questions asked of Jesus, and he answers one, and he says, look, this is going to happen before this generation passes away. And then he goes on to answer the second question of stuff that's going to take place way in the future. And so sometimes people get
Right.
confused and want to combine these things. And I guess the other part of it is we have to remember what literary style.
Good.
I mean, the Bible is a book. There are different literary styles, and so a lot of prophecy in the Old Testament is written as Hebrew poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And so poetry, and the other thing is these guys are sometimes describing things that they have very little reference, and they're like, Daniel, it was just this terrible beast. I don't even know what to say to it. It was just a terrible beast. So you have imagery that's like spiritual imagery that we don't have context to try to describe. And then you also have a literary style like in Isaiah where it's a lot of poetry. And so you have a style of writing that's sometimes almost trying to present perhaps a feeling more than it is a specific thing that he's referring to. So, and we obviously don't speak ancient Hebrew. I mean, we can translate it, but
A lot of cultural differences.
a lot of cultural differences.
Yeah.
In fact, I was on a similar note. People are studying, even going back just as far as Shakespeare. They're looking at these Shakespeare plays and they're reading them, and just some years back, as people studied Old English and what they were written in, they were realizing that they actually pronounce things different way. And they're like, once you realize they're actually pronouncing it, you realize, wait, this and this rhyme in that way of pronouncing it, and we've pronounced it wrong all this time, and it didn't really make sense to us. But now suddenly, once we realized, oh, they're pronouncing it this way, and it rhymes that
Right.
way, and it adds a whole new meaning to it. So we're trying to understand a centuries old language. I mean, we can understand it, but we miss cultural context to an extent. I mean, we can pick a lot of that stuff up from other writings, but it's not perfect. We just
Yeah.
don't know it completely.
One of the modern dilemmas that all of us face is we immediately read our cultural
Right.
context into a situation. I even think of, and I've done this before, where you're maybe teaching on a narrative story and you kind of read the passage, but then you also retell the story with a modern twist on
Right.
it. Like you make people say phrases and colloquialisms of today, or you say,
Yeah.
they're like hanging out. I have a Bible translation that was given to me that was kind of written for like an urban, unchurched person.
Mm-hmm.
And just like Jesus and his crew were hanging out, and it
Yeah.
uses that kind of language. So we're always tempted to take what we live in and pipe it back
Right.
into the scripture. And that's why it's so important to take time to try to understand the culture of the moment,
Mm-hmm.
the language, the meaning of words. The Bible is easy to understand. It also takes a lifetime to dive into. That's
Yeah.
the uniqueness of the literature, is you can get the basic idea, but then if you read into it what you think it means based upon a 2022 mindset, you can oftentimes make the mistake. And so
Yeah.
I think it happens with prophecies. People are constantly trying to say that I read this prophecy in Daniel or Revelation or one of the other Old Testament prophets, and they go, well, this is happening currently in our world, and therefore it must match up. And
Yeah.
as we've seen time and time again, that's not the case.
And how many times over just the last 100 years have people said, oh, this person is the beast. Oh, this is the end time because of this. This is the end time because of this. I mean, there was that church that was telling everybody that they knew the date, and they had all their members sell all their stuff, and they were going on the bus tour, and then the next day when it didn't happen,
Yeah.
whoops.
Yeah. That's why here's a pro tip for you. If you're going to pretend to be a prophet and say, like, Jesus is coming back, and you pick a date that's so far in the future that you won't be around when it doesn't happen. That's just,
Yeah.
we're here for that kind of service. No, really, it's not what we mean. But it's funny how people will really get clamped down on something, and then it doesn't work out to be true because they're using their own mindset to try to read into things. And
Yeah.
again, what's been a common theme throughout this whole series is that God wins, God is in control.
Yeah.
He controls the future. We don't need to worry.
Yeah. And
That's a big part of it.
I don't have it in front of me, but when the scripture in Matthew 23, when Jesus is giving this answer, and he's giving this answer about what's going to happen in the future, and he starts off with only the Father knows the date and the time,
Mm-hmm.
and so he kind of gives them these ideas about it, but then he says, I'm going to paraphrase here, but as for my disciples, they will be doing this. So it's like he's kind of saying, look, here's some stuff that you might look for, but what's really important is what you're doing at that time, and what you should be doing at that time is presenting the gospel.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Good. It's tricky. And, you can find 612 different interpretations on different things depending on who you read. And it's easy to get lost in one rabbit hole and follow that trail and really get locked into that. And I think we kind of have the understanding of, we try to understand as best we can. We see what has been fulfilled, but we're open to what Jesus is going to do in the future. And again, not to create fear or worry, but just to continue to do the work that God has set before us.
Yeah.
I mean, even Daniel, after he recovered, after he took his few personal days, he got back to work and he didn't really try to analyze and decipher things. He just went about the business of what was in front of him. Yeah.
in the end, we can't really control when that stuff happens anyway, and we have to focus on what we're called to do.
Right.
All right, so the last question, Daniel 7:13. In this passage, he refers to somebody as the Son of Man. And somebody asked, what is the significance of this referring to him as the Son of Man?
Yeah, this is really good. Great question, because this is a really powerful way to connect Daniel and what he is saying in this vision that he's having, connecting it to Jesus. Son of Man it actually is the most popular term that Jesus used to refer to himself in the Gospels. I looked it up before we started filming. 88 times in the New Testament, Jesus is referred to as the Son of Man. 69 of those times are just in the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so the synoptic Gospels. 69 times Jesus refers to himself as Son of Man. Stephen in Acts chapter 7, right before he is stoned, he refers to Jesus as the Son of Man. And so this title that Daniel mentions in Daniel 7 is the title that Jesus picks up on and uses to refer to himself. And the big mic drop happened when he was standing before the Sanhedrin after his arrest, before his crucifixion, and he combined the Daniel 7 mention of Son of Man with Psalm 110:1, where it says that basically my Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand. I'll make your enemies a footstool. Jesus combined those two passages together, referred to himself as Son of Man, and did something that God was going to do, God the Father and God the Son were going to do. And it's in Matthew's Gospel, it's in Mark's Gospel, and it's in Luke's Gospel that this was a key phrase that everyone in Jewish culture knew was referring to the Messiah to come. And Jesus referred to himself, brought it to himself. And
Yeah.
so he took the Daniel prophecy and said, yeah, that's me.
Yeah.
The Son of Man who stands before the Ancient of Days, that's me. So it's a big part of how we connect Old and New Testament together, how we connect Old Testament prophecy with Jesus in his first coming, is that title that he gives himself
Yeah.
is the reason why.
Well, and some people might quibble, saying, no, that's meant for that specific prophecy about the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days. A lot of people think that that's like a future thing yet to come. And one way I've heard it described, and this kind of goes along with some stuff is fulfilled now, some stuff is fulfilled in the future. Sometimes it's fulfilled both times.
Correct.
And the way they described it is that Jesus is saying this and saying this is less a one specific time this is going to happen, as like he described it as a coat or a set of clothing. In this instance, that fits the prophecy of Jesus standing before them, and in that sense, they would be the beast in that sense. But not that was specifically, this prophecy is here now, more like it's here now and it's also in the future.
Right, because the Son of Man is essentially, he's referring to himself as the perfect man, or the perfect version of humanity.
Right.
And Jesus never ceased being that.
Right.
Even after death, burial, resurrection, new body, at God's hand now, that he will eternally now be the Son of Man.
Yeah.
Identifying with the human people that he came to save, and yet also showing that he is the fulfillment of that prophecy, not just in that instance, but will be. And so will there be another time in the future where the Son of Man,
Right.
with the Ancient of Days, will stand before a beast of some type or some individual or group that is antagonistic toward him? That you could easily see that being something that will be a reoccurring theme. We've even
Right.
said that a few times, that these themes reoccur throughout Scripture. Jesus doesn't just interact with Satan once.
Right.
It's a constant back and forth. It's a reoccurring battle that occurs through prophecy, through Jesus' earthly ministry, and even on into the future of what's to come.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
point.
And these themes are repeated.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like sometimes prophecy is for this, but then it's also for this.
Right.
And sometimes you don't know that until you're looking back on it.
Right.
Because when you're looking forwards to it, you have this vision, but when you look back on it, you can, that's in anything in life. You make a plan, you go out to do something, and you're like, afterwards you look, we did a SWOT analysis today. Well, what went good and what went bad? Well, from the front, it looked fine. Now from the back, we see, well, we could have done this better, and
Right.
this could have. And so we can look back on some of these prophecies and say, oh yeah, here we can see this fulfilled, and yet there's still more that we're looking to the future to. So, even we won't have them perfect, or, someday Jesus can explain it to us.
In eternity, we'll have some time to hash that stuff out.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, any last thoughts?
Just again, reminding ourselves that it's really easy to get lost in the weeds on all of these prophetic visions and dreams.
Yeah.
There's more to come. The chapter this weekend is, it's a doozy. It names the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks by name in the chapter, which is kind of interesting.
That's also how we know what
that
some of
helps
them
a little
refer
bit.
to.
Gives us a little hint there. But
Yeah.
again, just as Pastor Ray has been mentioning time and time again, that it's an understanding of that God, it is his story. History is his story. Maybe you've heard that before. And so the details may be up for great discussion, fun to talk about, but in the bigger picture, just recognizing that why should we fear, much like Daniel doesn't fear, when we recognize that God has things completely already under his control. He is not controlling, but he is in control, as Pastor Ray said last week. And it's fun to think about and talk about these things, but we can rest in that assurance.
Yeah. All right. Well, we appreciate you guys being with us, and we will be back next week for chapter 8.
See you next week.